Hi, this is Kim Hammer, pastor of Saline Baptist Church in the community of Tull outside Benton with your devotion taken from the book of Joshua chapter 8. We find that Israel has dealt with the sin that plagued their nation and caused them to be routed by the city of Ai. Now that they had taken care of the sin of Achan that had affected not only his life but affected the whole nation, they were ready to turn their attention back toward Ai and do to Ai what they originally intended to do, which was to defeat them. In verse 1, God tells the nation of Israel and tells Joshua, don't be afraid and don't be discouraged. They had fallen into a state of fear and they'd fallen into a state of discouragement because of the sin that was prevalent in their life. But once they purged the sin from their life, they did not have to worry about being afraid and they did not have to worry about being discouraged as far as facing their enemy. There's a spiritual lesson in that. We deal with fear and we deal with discouragement every day, but we don't need to add to the fear and discouragement that we deal with every day by having sin that creates fear and discouragement. If we keep our life pure and righteous before the eyes of God, whatever fear and discouragement we may face won't be because we have sin hidden in our life. As we go on and we see how the chapter plays out, we see that God promised to the nation of Israel that he would deliver Ai unto them. And that's one of the things we need to know, that as long as we're walking in a right relationship with God, he will deliver for us. Doesn't mean he'll give us everything we want, but he will deliver to us everything that we need. He wanted them to know that he would provide all the provisions of life to them. In fact, that was one thing different as far as what he gave them in the way of instruction about taking the city of Ai versus the city of Jericho. Before, in the city of Jericho, he said, destroy everything except for the valuables and bring and dedicate them unto me. But he told them when they went into the city of Ai that anything that they captured in the way of livestock or provisions that they could have for themselves. God is not going to starve us out, but God is going to keep us dependent upon him. And that's one thing he wanted the nation of Israel to know, was that he was going to provide to the needs of their life at exactly the right time when they needed it. The one thing we also notice is that God gave them a simple instruction in verse 2, where he gave it to Joshua. He said, go set an ambush. He didn't go into specific details, and Joshua didn't ask him about specific details, because Joshua, having been made right in the eyes of the Lord along with the nation of Israel, having dealt with the sin, was going to leave the complicated matters unto God. Sometimes what we need to focus on as God's children is not going down in the weeds and worrying about the specific details if God gives us a specific charge, but it's a matter of just being obedient and keeping our lives in a right position with God, so that when he delivers us an order, when he gives us a calling or a challenge, that we are more concerned about being obedient and less concerned about helping God figure out the details. We find that as they go on, the other thing that we notice is that as chapter in verse 3, that man's wisdom is replaced with God's wisdom. Before, when Joshua sent out spies to spy out Ai and brought them back, or they came back and they said, we can take care of it with 2,000 or 3,000 men. That was Joshua relying on human wisdom. But this time God provided spiritual wisdom. And instead of just sending 2,000 or 3,000, they put the whole 40,000 up against a city that was 12,000 between the men, the women, and the children. What would it have been like if Joshua would have sent the whole 40,000 against Ai? If that victory would have been won, he would have become even more self-reliant upon his own wisdom. But as it was, God, knowing what he knew that Joshua did not know, and that was that there was sin in the camp, God utilized it in order to teach Joshua and the nation of Israel another valuable lesson. God is always in the business of teaching us valuable lessons if we'll just pay attention. And this time, God said, we're going to send all 40,000, but you're going to experience the victory because it's going to be by my wisdom and not by yours. As the battle goes on and we see that they set an ambush around all three sides of the city, we find that Joshua takes 5,000 fighting men. He goes to the gate and he camps out the night before. And early in the morning, the king of Ai and the fighting men come out after them, just as they thought they were going to do before. They thought they would whip Israel again. But as they got away from the city, we find that the 35,000 men of Israel that had hidden around three sides of the city came in and ambushed them. And they took the city and they burned it. It was a city of 12,000, as I mentioned a while ago. And one of the things that's interesting is it shows us that Joshua stood there and he held out his javelin. And as he held out his javelin, the fighting men came in and they destroyed the city. Reminded us what Moses experienced as Aaron and Hur helped hold up his arm back in the book of Exodus chapter 27 and verse 11. And as long as they were helping him hold up his arms, they prevailed against their enemy. In same fashion, Joshua again, remembering the experience that he had seen with Moses, held up his javelin, and the men came down upon the city of Ai, and they destroyed them down to the very last human. Why did they burn the city down? You may notice that back in Genesis chapter 17 and verse 8, we find that Abram had built an altar there under the commandment of God. My personal opinion, one reason they burnt the city down was because it would send a message to all the other cities around there as they saw the smoke ascending up into heaven. They knew that the nation of Israel was getting closer. But the second thing is, when you go back to the book of Genesis chapter 17 and verse 8, where Abram set up an altar to worship the Lord, that had been replaced with false idol worship of the city of Ai. And I think this was God's way of redeeming the city back, and it laid in ruins even unto today. What did Joshua do after he had claimed the victory in Ai? There are 4 important things that we need to take from this. Whenever it is that God gives our enemy over to us and we claim an important battle, follow the example of Joshua. The first thing he did was worship. And the second thing he did was he expressed obedience to the word of God taken from the book of Exodus chapter 20 and verse 25. And he did as Moses had commanded, that he built an altar to worship the Lord. He blessed the Israelites. He commended them for the job that they had done. He did not take all the credit for himself, but he made sure that God got the credit, and those that helped him get there received credit and also recognition for what they had done to contribute to the victory. And the last thing he did was he paused and he read the law in its entirety as he had been commanded to do. The reason Joshua was successful was because he got out of the way and let God lead the way. And then he paused to worship the Lord after the victory had been delivered to him.